What is cultural Marxism anyway? I keep hearing the term cultural Marxism. I usually hear it from people who hate the idea, who think that cultural Marxism is a bad thing, but it occurred to me, what are they talking about? What even is cultural Marxism? In my PhD studies, I learned quite a bit about Marx. We had to read a lot of his writing. And I know that Marx did not value the concept of culture at all. He thought that culture was ideology, and he claimed that all ideology is used by the rich to oppress the poor. He thought that religion was used that way, culture was used that way, philosophy was used that way. So the idea of cultural Marxism didn't really make any sense to me. Marx was kind of anti-culture, not just counterculture. He wasn't just wanting to create a different culture that would oppose the ruling class. He was anti-culture. He thought that culture was useless and always going to be a tool for the powerful to abuse the powerless. So what is cultural Marxism? That didn't really make any sense to me. So I started investigating, asking the question, what is cultural Marxism? It turns out that there's a good reason why the term cultural Marxism doesn't make any sense. It's because it is a right-wing conspiracy theory that has nothing to do with reality or the reality of Marxism. So let's get into it. After Marx died, there were a group of thinkers in Germany that followed Marx's ideas. They called themselves the Frankfurt School. They were a group of professors and just kind of social thinkers who all were friends and knew each other and worked together in Germany in 1920s to 1930s. Some of the people associated with this, most famously, would be Horkheimer and Adorno. They are famous sociologists, but there are some other big names attached to it as well. After Hitler came to power and sociologists and social thinkers started being persecuted, they left. They moved to the United States. They founded the New School for Social Research in New York. A lot of these thinkers happen to be Jews, which probably isn't surprising that a lot of Jews would have been persecuted in Germany and immigrated to the United States when Hitler was in power. Of course, it was dangerous to be a Jew in Germany, so it's not a coincidence or a surprise that these people who immigrated from Germany were Jews for the most part. Now, these people thought that Marx was onto something. They weren't exactly like anti-Marxist, but they were working from his ideas and expanding them. And one of the big things that they believed when they were expanding Marx's ideas was that he had ignored the role of culture too much. They thought that while Marx just kind of dismissed culture as something the rich uses to oppress the poor, and then he just kind of moved on and went on and talked about economic theory, this group of people, who we now call the Frankfurt School, focused on that idea a lot more. They wanted to drill down into, to pick apart exactly how culture is created by the rich and how it is used to oppress the poor. So they wanted to actually do like media analysis, listen to the radio and find out what messages people are hearing on their radio addresses. What do movies look like in the United States and around the world? How do those movies reinforce the ideas of the rich and those ideas that help oppress the poor? So they were wanting to drill down a lot more into culture. They claimed that culture wasn't just this throwaway, nothing, unimportant facet of life, as Marx would have said, because Marx was only focused on the money. The economy, that's all he cared about. Instead, these people were saying, no, culture is an important part of how the rich, the bourgeoisie, oppress the poor, the proletariat. So they came up with what they called cultural Marxism. Now, this wasn't cultural Marxism as we know it today. This was just an examination of this concept. How is culture used by the rich to oppress the poor? That's all that the Frankfurt School meant by cultural Marxism, as far as I can tell. Now, here's where the conspiracy theory part of it comes in. In the 1990s, there were a handful of far right thinkers. A lot of these people were white nationalists. Today, we would probably call them neo-Nazis, although they didn't call themselves that for sure. And the term wasn't as common in the 1990s. So they would have called themselves far right or conservative thinkers. This group of people almost exclusively drew from just 7 texts. If you look at the body of literature that these far-right thinkers created in the 1990s and early 2000s, it can seem as though this was like this huge idea, but in reality, almost all of them were citing each other, referencing each other, giving quotes from each other. When you drill down to the bottom of it, almost all of the texts that they ever cited were just 7 texts, and among those 7 texts, there were only about 4 writers, and the most influential of those was this guy named Lind. Lind wrote a book called What is Political Correctness in 2004, drawing on these ideas from the 1990s, and this book became an extremely popular book among the circles of far-right people who believe in this conspiracy theory. Okay, so now let's answer the question, what does this book say? What was this conspiracy theory about? This conspiracy theory was definitely wrapped up in the idea that a lot of the Frankfurt School philosophers were Jews. The conspiracy theory is definitely anti-Semitic. It is racist against Jews. So that's something to know. There was this conspiracy theory that all of these Jewish scholars had come from Germany in the 1930s and immigrated to the United States, mostly to New York, and that there they had used their Marxist ideas and decided to dismantle the United States culture, traditions, and heritage. This whole thing, according to the conspiracy theorists, was purposeful, calculated, conscious attempt to destroy the United States from the inside, to destroy American values. In this book, Lynn's book, What is Political Correctness from 2004, he argues that even though it's very clear that Marx was only concerned about the economy and wasn't concerned at all about culture, he argues that economic Marxism failed. It has clearly, obviously failed thanks to communist countries falling like the USSR, or what he would characterize as the failure of Cuba, North Korea, and other communist countries around the world. They can't continue to claim that economic Marxism is a winning theory, so instead they have to take all their ideas and transfer them over to what he calls cultural Marxism, and this is what he claimed the Frankfurt School did. He tried to find parallels between economic Marxism and what he called cultural Marxism. Keep in mind, Lind is making up cultural Marxism at this point. He claimed that both economic Marxism and cultural Marxism want to create a classless, totalitarian society, that they both emphasize inequality, that they both declare some groups evil and other groups good. In the case of economic Marxism, it was the bourgeoisie who's evil and the proletariat who's good. In the case of cultural Marxism, it's white men who are evil and all minorities who are good. And he claimed that both want to punish the evil and reward the good. One of the reasons why we would call this a conspiracy theory and not a true reading of history is because if you actually look at the Frankfurt School's writings, people who were in the Frankfurt School when it had moved over to the United States, Lynn's characterization of their writing is just not accurate at all. He's claiming that they have this hidden agenda to infiltrate society, that they realized that they would never meet their political and economic goals until they had changed the culture, that they wanted to dismantle traditional marriage and traditional family and patriarchy, and they wanted to basically have a liberal agenda. Everything that you've heard of, a liberal agenda. Allow gay people to have rights, allow transgender people to have rights, etc., etc. But in fact, if you actually look at the earliest Frankfurt School's writings on what they would have called cultural Marxism, literally all they were doing was analyzing media and talking about how that media may serve the interests of the rich and not serve the interests of the poor. That's it. There is no hint of an agenda concerning race, political correctness, gender, sexual orientation, none of that. In fact, we have historical records of people who we would now call social justice warriors arguing with the Frankfurt School so much that they actually protested the Frankfurt School and would show up in their classrooms and try to disrupt the teaching that was going on, saying, you guys only care about the economy, you only care about class, you're ignoring race, you're ignoring gender, you're ignoring sexual orientation. So yeah, Lynn's idea from his 2004 book, What is Political Correctness, was completely wrong. It was completely fabricated. There is this idea among the far right now that the US would have held on to our quote unquote traditional values, by which they almost always mean sexism, racism, homophobia, that the US would have held on to those traditional values if not for this shadowy cabal of Jews who infiltrated the United States with the intent of destroying our culture and our traditions and our values. This idea has spread in far-right circles, and this idea is called cultural Marxism. Now, at this point, if you use the term cultural Marxism and you're meaning the actual original intent of the Frankfurt School, the way that they use the words cultural Marxism, nobody's going to understand what you're talking about. The phrase has changed to indicate this conspiracy theory. Some examples of this conspiracy theory are Pat Buchanan's book in 2002. His book was titled The Death of the West. It claimed that the Frankfurt School conspiracy undermined US values from the inside. These terrifying Jewish immigrants came to the United States and undermined our values, and otherwise we would still be holding to those values from the 1920s. There was a 2011 film that was called Cultural Marxism, The Corruption of America. It was created by Yeager, and it featured Buchanan, as well as a lot of these other kinds of right-wing thinkers. There was a terrorist, I'm sorry if I mispronounce this person's name, Breivik, who was Norwegian. He killed 77 people, and in his manifesto, as he was describing why he was going to go on this rampage before he did, he wrote extensively about cultural Marxism. In fact, his manifesto has the words cultural Marxism in it more than 100 times. The Australian Tea Party, which is modeled after the United States Tea Party, has a section on its website devoted to the Frankfurt School and this quote-unquote vast conspiracy to destroy Western culture. It lists a whole lot of facets of Western culture which they claim the Frankfurt School is out to destroy. Here are some of these facets, and I'm going to give you the real quote from the website, the list. They say that the Frankfurt School is trying to destroy Christianity, capitalism, authority, the family, patriarchy, morality, tradition, sexual restraint, loyalty, patriotism, nationalism, heredity, ethnocentrism, and conservatism. The British National Party, which is a far-right political movement, has multiple blog entries on their website about this supposed vast conspiracy. In 2003, the Poverty Law Center noticed that the conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism was going mainstream, and it was around that time that the term cultural Marxism stopped being associated with the actual ideas that the Frankfurt School had and started being associated with this purposeful, underground, conspiratorial thinking. Sometimes the conspiracy theory gets all wrapped up in anti-Muslim sentiment. Sometimes people will claim that the Frankfurt School was trying to allow the West to embrace Muslim values, which is really bizarre. I mean, none of it is true, but it's a very strange take on it. It has also been tied in with Zionism at times. It's also been tied in with conspiracy theories about globalists. So there's all kinds of different directions that you could go with this conspiracy theory, and people have gone in a lot of different directions, attacking all kinds of different groups that they didn't like or that they were racist against. When people discuss traditional Western culture, they're very often using that as a stand-in for white culture. There's the assumption that anything that is traditionally Western is white. So an attack on traditional Western values is, in the conspiracy theorists' minds, an attack on whites. So this whole thing gets tied in with race very easily. Now, of course, there are serious problems with this conspiracy theory. It doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny because it's not factual. So one of the problems with the conspiracy is that they claim that there is this clash between whites and minorities, and there's a clash between feminists and people who are misogynists, right? All of these different clashes in society. And this conspiracy theory claims that surely these clashes wouldn't exist if not for a Marxist philosophy, when in fact lots of different philosophers over time have described this clash between powerful and powerless groups. It can be found in Machiavelli's writing, in Hobbes, in Nietzsche, in Ayn Rand even, who is certainly not a leftist. So the idea that there's a clash in society isn't necessarily Marxist, although a lot of the conspiracy theorists will argue that anytime someone talks about a clash in society, they're secretly Marxist. This is proof of our conspiracy theory, and that's just not true. Another problem is, as I've described, the Frankfurt School wasn't talking about how to infiltrate society, how to infiltrate culture and remake it in their own image. They were actually trying to dismantle culture and understand how it was simply a tool in their minds for the bourgeoisie to oppress the proletariat. In fact, they were trying to dismantle culture and destroy it. So that's another problem with the conspiracy theorists, that their ideas have no basis in fact. Here's another problem with a conspiracy theorist. There is an actual group of British New Left Marxists who are working to try and bring Marx's idea into the modern era by updating it and changing it. And these people sound absolutely nothing like the cultural Marxists that these conspiracy theorists have made up in their heads. The conservatives invented cultural Marxism as a boogeyman, as a straw man that they can attack, in spite of the fact that the actual neo-Marxists is what you would call it. Neo means new, so the new Marxists, the modern Marxists, don't say anything like what they're talking about. These conspiracy theories have taken some really weird turns, including the idea that the Frankfurt School had such a nefarious purpose. Adorno was actually a musicologist, and he was a Jew, which of course they're terrified of. There's this wild conspiracy theory associated with cultural Marxism that claims that Adorno was the one who wrote most of the Beatles songs. That's not true. Adorno did not write the Beatles songs. Like, that's not historically accurate. Another problem with this conspiracy is that in reality, the left is full of disagreement and infighting. If it is a conspiracy where there's some kind of shadowy cabal that's controlling the left and making everyone think the same way and do the same things and create the same culture, then that shadowy cabal is a complete failure because the left argues amongst themselves all the time. If you're ever in leftist spaces, you can see the arguments between people who have philosophical differences. It sure doesn't seem as though there is just this one agenda that's being pushed by a shadowy cabal of Jews in the background. That's just not true. Marx himself had very little interest in discussing either race or gender. He lived through the Civil War in the United States, and as a reporter, he definitely knew about the Civil War and covered it for his readers in Europe. But he didn't want to focus on race. He thought that everything came down to class and class structure and economic inequalities. So the idea that you're building off the foundation that Marx laid when you're talking about gender or class is just, it's a stretch. It is possible to say that, but it's a bit of a stretch. And most of the Marxists who are alive today, who are trying to build off of his thoughts, focus on class much more than they focus on gender and race. And in fact, you can see those arguments if you go into leftist spaces. You'll see the Marxists claiming that everything is about social class, it's all about money and inequality. And then you'll see other people saying, no, but what about race? What about gender? The idea that these cultural Marxists, that Marx's ideological followers today are pushing some kind of woke political agenda is just nonsense. In fact, today's Marxists are very often accused by leftists of not being woke enough. There's a fight between these two groups. They aren't working together, and they're definitely not the same people. Cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that is being propagated by the far right. It has no basis in factual history. It has no basis in the reality of Marxism today. It has no basis in Marx's original ideas. It is not supported by any evidence or data. There was something originally called cultural Marxism in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, but that concept had absolutely no relationship with the concept of cultural Marxism as being discussed by far right politicians and far right conspiracy theorists.